Welcome to the Mortarboard, the administrator's source for solutions in higher education. We tell you about challenges other schools have faced, benchmark the problem, share their best practices and epic fails, and invite you to consider whether what worked for them might also work at your institution. Hosted by longtime college president Dr. Dan Barwick, this is the Mortarboard, the source for solutions in higher education.
Welcome to the Mortarboard, your source for solutions in higher education. I'm Dan Barwick. Welcome to the podcast. If the content of this podcast interests you, then you'll enjoy my new book, Risk and Reward: How Small Colleges Get Better Against the Odds. It's now available from Amazon in ebook, paperback, and audiobook format. The best way to find it is to head over to my blog, mortarboardblog.com, and click on the link on the front page. If you have any thoughts about the book, don't hesitate to send me an email and let me know what you think. My guest today is Peter Coy, who writes a newsletter on economics for the New York Times opinion section. Until July 2021, he was economics editor of Bloomberg Businessweek. Mr. Coy joined Businessweek, the predecessor to Bloomberg Businessweek, in 1989 as telecommunications editor. He became technology editor in 1992, and then associate economics editor in 97, before being named economics editor in 2001. He came to Businessweek from the Associated Press in New York, where he had served as a business news writer since 1985. Mr. Coy holds a BA in history from Cornell University. He recently published an article in the New York Times opinion section entitled, "How Much Deference Do Elite U.S. Colleges Deserve?" In the article, he asks the broader question of whether Ivy League universities and other renowned institutions still deserve deference and freedom of action because of their contributions to society, or whether they should be scrutinized like any other self-interested institutions, such as tire manufacturers. Mr. Coy, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, you say that there are at least two questions at stake. The lesser one being whether elite universities broke the law, and the greater one being whether universities deserve the legal protections and deference that they currently get. I think the lawsuit probably doesn't make sense unless we understand the broader issue, the deference shown to elite schools. Now, most people are likely unaware that a specific group of schools have a temporary exemption from the antitrust law. Can you describe this exemption and the history behind it, how it came about?
Yeah, well, first of all, back on the terms of what's lesser and what's greater, these universities don't regard this lawsuit as being a lesser threat. As a journalist, tend to use the term broader in the sense that this is an issue that goes beyond just these particular universities. But I don't want to minimize the lawsuit to say, that's just a narrow thing, because it's not at all a narrow thing. So we can maybe go back to the specific issues in the lawsuit, but let's go, as you suggest, to the broad question, which is there are a bunch of universities that are need blind, and I guess your audience knows what that means, but let's go over it anyway. Need blind admissions means that you admit students without regard to whether they can pay the full freight or not. And then only after you've offered them admission and they've accepted your offer, do you figure out what they need for financial aid to cover their costs. And so this is considered a progressive sort of thing to do. It allows financially poorer students to attend university they might not otherwise be able to attend.
You mean the premise behind it is that a needy student wouldn't find himself excluded from admission because he was needy? That is, the school. Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Wouldn't be filling up the school with a lot of rich kids because they can pay full freight. And so the history is that there was a famous case of something called the overlap group, which was the 8 Ivy League universities plus MIT that were charged with antitrust by the Justice Department in 1991. And they had agreed not to outbid one another for students through their financial aid packages. So the all the 8 Ivies settled, MIT chose to go to court and eventually lost. That was kind of left a lot of balls up in the air. So Congress sort of settled it with a special exemption from antitrust law in 1992. And that exemption said that it was sort of a way to reward schools that are need blind, perceiving it as a good thing, saying, if you are need blind, and it has to be need blind for all admissions, not just a portion, that in that specific case, you are allowed to have some coordination of your financial aid policies. Now, that does not mean you can look at individual students and say, we're giving Mary $4,500. Don't give her more than that. But it does say that you have to follow a fairly strict rubric for how financial aid is determined.
Can you just explain how are schools disadvantaged if they don't coordinate?
Yeah, you're jumping right to a super important question. I mean, this is only a limited number of schools that are in this pot. If you choose not to participate in this group, then actually in some ways you would have an advantage over other schools because you could cherry pick students. You could say, I really want this particular student, so I'm going to offer her a better package than would be allowed under this rubric that we all agreed to. And you would get that student. So this is actually very typical of a cartel. And I don't want to accuse them of being a cartel, but just bear with me while we discuss the concept. I cover economics. I don't cover law. Think about OPEC. The members of OPEC agree on a certain oil production quota, but then there's always a temptation to overproduce. The purpose of the quotas is to jack up the price of oil. So now you're producing more at that high price. But if everybody starts cheating, then there's overproduction and the price falls for everybody. So cartels are inherently prone to people cheating, basically, defecting from the cartel. And the plaintiffs in this lawsuit actually use the word cartel to describe the group of universities that have formed this agreement. One thing you said, and I just want to alter it just slightly, is that there's a certain number of universities that are exempt. It's not limited to these universities. Any university in the country that chose to be need blind for all its admissions would be permitted to coordinate. It's just that this is the group that's chosen to take advantage of that provision.
So the exemption, you've explained that they can adopt a need blind perspective, but what is the relationship between adopting a need blind position and then needing antitrust legislation to protect you? What is the purpose of the antitrust legislation?
That's a question I asked during my reporting, and a lot of people sort of scratched their heads and said, well, I should never really thought about that. But the best answer I could get is that the antitrust exemption is a sort of a reward to universities that provide need blind admissions. The thought is that, again, if one university tried to sort of do the right thing, but then another came along and undermined it by picking off the best students by giving them a better financial aid package, then the university that was trying to do the right thing would be upset. So this way, they're all kind of, it's like a balance where they're all following the same rules. I should say that it's not all elite universities. There are a lot of very good schools in the country they're not part of this group, and including 3 of the biggest names of all, Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford. And we can get into that, but it's revealing that this is not a universal thing.
And I think in the case of Harvard, their reasoning for not joining was because it would actually mean that they would award less financial aid in certain cases than they would have wanted to.
Right, and that's true of Yale as well, which was left, and then came back. And their director of financial aid, I quote in my article, or I should say Cesar Storlazzi, he was the director of student financial services, told the Yale Daily News in 2008 that by leaving the group, we haven't even named it yet, but it's called the 568 Presidents Group, Yale was free to give families more aid than they would have gotten under the consensus methodology that the group members commit to following.
Why don't we turn now to the subject of the lawsuit itself? Can you begin with sort of the facts of the case and what the plaintiffs are alleging in this specific case?
Facts are that we have these universities that formed this group, and they call it the 568 Presidents Group, and it's named after a section of a 1994 law that extended that exemption. Membership has fluctuated a bit over the years. Some schools have been in it right from the start. The lawsuit is fairly narrow in one sense because all they need to show is that the universities did not obey the letter of the law. And so if they can demonstrate that some schools admitted some students on a basis that was not need blind, then they sort of win the case, as far as I can tell. They don't have to show that the law is wrong or that there's something that's not a good idea to allow coordination. The law says you're allowed to use it under these conditions, but if you violate the conditions, then you've broken the law. That's their argument.
So they took the advantage of the antitrust exemption, but didn't follow the rules they had to follow in order to earn that exemption.
That's the accusation. So, there's a quote in the lawsuit from Gordon Gee, the former chancellor of Vanderbilt, and former President Brown, both of which are named defendants, who once said that any school president under the influence of truth serum would concede that donor connections make a difference in admissions. That's in the lawsuit. Columbia University openly states in that admissions to its School of General Studies, although not its other undergraduate units, are not need blind. So the plaintiffs, it's a class action lawsuit, are saying, look, on the face of it, you're breaking the law. The law says it has to be everybody admitted on a need blind basis. I can imagine the defense is probably going to be along the lines of, well, it doesn't have to be everybody. That's, going too far or something like that. I'm not sure exactly how they'll say it.
Or they might argue, for example, that someone acted on their own initiative to bring in a student, perhaps with the hope of a donation, but they're not following school policy when they do that.
Yeah, something like that. I'm not going to try to prepare the defense of the universities.
Well, actually, you mentioned earlier Yale's former director of student financial services, who seems to have provided a bit of a smoking gun in this case. Could you just take us through that?
Yeah, you brought it up a little bit earlier, which is that why did they leave? It's because they said the families would have gotten more aid under the consensus methodology. And he said that they would have gotten more aid from Yale if they were not bound by the rules of the consensus methodology used by the 568 Presidents Group. And he said what's not good about the 568 approach is that it has a one needs analysis formula that everyone has to sign on to. Funny thing, because it's a smoking gun if what you care about is the sort of the equity here. It's not as much of a smoking gun if you're just looking at what's going to win or lose the lawsuit, because again, that's not the accusation in the lawsuit. The accusation is really about whether they did or did not break the terms of the law. Whether you provide richer or stingy financial aid is a question that the lawsuit does not directly address, although, you have to imagine that if you're going to court, it's going to influence people. Like, aren't you just taking advantage of the terms of this exemption to save money on financial aid? That'll be bound to come up.
Well, for the article, you talked to Sarah Flanagan, the Vice President for Government Relations and Policy Development for the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities. So she makes the interesting and the seemingly counterintuitive claim that in higher education, quote, competition has probably led to higher prices. Now, I think at this point, when I ask you to explain that, I think you're going to end up talking about the concepts you talked about before, the way a cartel operates and what happens when people deviate from how the cartel is supposed to operate. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. Can you talk a little bit about her idea that competition has actually led to higher prices?
The argument would be that university enrolls a freshman class and it has to decide how much it has. Imagine it has a sort of a fixed financial aid budget. What does it do with that budget? How does it distribute it? If it spends more of its money to lure in, imagine the tuition is $50,000, which is a low number these days for some of these schools, believe it or not. But let's say $70,000, okay. If it says, wow, I want to get some of those 70,000 students in here, I bet if I threw 5,000 at them, I'd be able to net 65,000, and that'd be pretty good. If you do that, then you've used up your budget, and it's going to be harder to bring in students who can only afford 20 or 10 or 0. So in that scenario, the price would go up for some students, price of education. The lower income students would be disadvantaged in this competitive world. That's the kind of argument she's making. And I probably need to make clear here that she is not commenting on this lawsuit specifically, and she's not speaking on behalf of the defendants. She's speaking more in generalities, but it's still, I thought it was still an interesting point, deserves to be brought up.
It was. Now, regardless of how the lawsuit plays out, I do want to ask you one final question. You do point out one likely outcome, the non-renewal of the school's antitrust exemption. Can you describe why you think that will happen?
Well, this has been renewed periodically ever since 1992 and by Congress. And over the years, though, Congress, it's not just Congress, the general public has kind of lost some of its love for higher education, and specifically some of these elite schools. And I cite an opinion poll from the Pew Research Group that in 2019, only 1/3 of Republicans and Republican-leaning voters thought colleges and universities had a positive effect on the way things are going in this country. That was down from more than half who said so just 7 years earlier in 2012. Support among Democrats is high and steady, and by contrast. But it's not a good thing when you're sort of perceived almost as the enemy by some Republicans in Congress. And then this lawsuit comes along, and it's bound to expose some stuff that the universities would probably rather not have exposed. And that's bound to further sully their image and make it harder to justify why they should get a special exemption from antitrust law.
So you have an audience, Congress, that is increasingly unsympathetic to the universities. And then this lawsuit sort of brings out some dirty laundry and makes it even harder for the Congress to be supportive.
That's what I'm arguing. Could be wrong. Maybe it will get renewed, but it comes up for renewal. The current exemption expires on September 30th. So let's see.
My guest has been Peter Coy, who writes about economics for the opinion section of the New York Times. Before joining the New York Times in July 2021, he spent nearly 32 years writing for Businessweek and its successor, Bloomberg Businessweek. You can follow Peter at Peter Coy, that's Petercoy on Twitter. Peter, thanks very much for being with me today.
Thank you very much as well. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining me. Please feel free to email me with questions, comments, or suggestions for content that you'd like to hear about. You can reach me at mortarboardpodcast@gmail.com. Consider stopping by my blog, mortarboardblog.com. The blog contains links to stories that I think will interest you, podcast transcripts, and articles I've written. You can also like me on Facebook at Dr. Daniel Barwick or follow me on Twitter at Daniel Barwick. Looking forward to talking with you in the next episode.